My daughter-in-law Carmen posted a meme yesterday showing an old woman in a coffin with the caption, "When Grandma finally stops giving unsolicited advice." She tagged me in it. While I was sitting in my living room, very much alive, drinking my morning coffee. So I commented back, "Thanks for the heads up. Just updated my will. You're going to love the new beneficiary list." The silence that followed was deafening, but it was just the beginning of the most liberating 6 months of my life. The notification pinged on my phone at exactly 7:23 a.m. on a Tuesday morning. I remember the time because I was reaching for my reading glasses, squinting at the screen in that soft morning light that filters through my kitchen window. At first, I thought it was one of those generic memes that people share without thinking. You know the type. Something about coffee or Monday mornings that gets passed around Facebook like a digital chain letter. But then I saw my name tagged at the bottom, and my stomach dropped like a stone thrown into still water. The image was crude, poorly edited, showing an elderly woman with gray hair lying in what was clearly meant to be a casket. Someone had added cartoon X's over her eyes and a speech bubble coming from her mouth that read, "Finally quiet." The main text overlay said, "When Grandma finally stops giving unsolicited advice," followed by 3 crying, laughing emojis. Carmen had shared it to her timeline, tagged me, and added her own comment. Some people just don't know when to mind their own business. Truth yar family darf boundaries. I stared at that screen for what felt like an eternity, my coffee growing cold in my hands. The mug was one that my son Daniel had given me last Mother's Day, white ceramic with purple flowers and "World's Best Mom" written in elegant script. The irony wasn't lost on me as I sat there, very much alive, looking at what amounted to a digital gravestone with my name on it. Carmen had posted this at 11:47 p.m. the night before, which meant she'd been lying in bed next to my son, plotting this little piece of psychological warfare while he slept beside her. The worst part wasn't just the meme itself, though that was bad enough. It was the comments that had started rolling in underneath it. Carmen's sister Brenda had written "dead" with skull emojis. Her college friend Michelle had responded with "savage but accurate." Even worse, 3 of her coworkers from the dental office where she worked as a hygienist had liked the post. People I'd never met, who knew nothing about me except what Carmen chose to share, were essentially celebrating the idea of my death. I felt something cold and sharp settle in my chest, like I'd swallowed a piece of broken glass. This wasn't just disrespect. This was active cruelty. Carmen had taken whatever frustrations she had with me and turned them into public entertainment, using the most vulnerable image possible: an elderly woman in death. She'd made me into a punchline, a cautionary tale, a burden that everyone would be relieved to be rid of. And she'd done it with the casual cruelty of someone who genuinely believed she was in the right. The thing is, I could understand being frustrated with me. I'm 62 years old, and I've lived through enough to have opinions about most things. I've seen Daniel make mistakes, watched him struggle with decisions, and yes, I've offered advice when I thought he needed it. But I'd never been the stereotypical, meddling mother-in-law that Carmen was painting me as. I'd gone out of my way to respect their relationship, their home, their parenting choices. When they'd moved into their house 2 years ago, I'd helped them paint the nursery for my granddaughter Sophia, without saying a word about the color choice, even though that particular shade of yellow made me think of baby vomit. I'd bitten my tongue when Carmen insisted on feeding Sophia nothing but organic, locally sourced, free-range everything, even though the baby was clearly always hungry and fussy. I'd smiled and nodded when she'd explained her complex system of scheduled feeding, times and mandatory tummy time, and absolutely no screen time before age 2. I'd even pretended to be interested when she'd launched into her 20-minute explanation of why traditional baby formula was basically poison, despite the fact that I'd raised 3 healthy children on the stuff back when organic wasn't even a word people used about food. But apparently none of that restraint mattered. In Carmen's mind, I was the stereotypical mother-in-law from hell, the one who couldn't mind her own business, the one whose death would be a relief rather than a loss. She'd reduced me to a caricature, a punchline, a problem to be solved rather than a person to be respected. And she'd done it publicly, where my friends could see it, where my neighbors might stumble across it, where anyone who knew me might wonder if there was truth to the joke. I thought about Daniel, still asleep upstairs in their bedroom, completely unaware that his wife had essentially wished his mother dead on the internet. Daniel, who called me every Sunday evening just to check in, who still asked for my recipe for pot roast even though he'd been making it for years, who'd cried in my arms just 6 months ago when he'd gotten passed over for that promotion at the engineering firm. What would he think when he saw this? Would he defend me, or would he tell me I was overreacting, that it was just a joke, that I should let it go? The more I stared at that meme, the more details I noticed that made it worse. Someone had taken time to edit this image, to add the X's over the I's, to choose just the right font for the text overlay. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment share. This was premeditated. Carmen had either made this herself or had gone looking, specifically for something cruel enough to capture her feelings about me. She'd chosen an image of death, of finality, of an old woman reduced to nothing more than a source of annoyance that everyone would be glad to see gone. My hands were shaking. As I set down the coffee mug, the ceramic making a sharp clink against the wooden table, I realized I was crying, not the dramatic, heaving sobs of movie grief, but the quiet, steady tears of someone who'd been cut deeply by someone they'd tried to love. Because I had tried to love Carmen. When Daniel had first brought her home, 5 years ago, glowing with the kind of happiness that makes a mother's heart sing, I'd opened my arms to her. I'd welcomed her into our family traditions, shared our stories, tried to make her feel like she belonged. I'd spent hours helping her plan their wedding, driving all over the county to look at venues and sample cakes and compare flower arrangements. When she'd stressed about the guest list, worried about mixing her family with ours, I'd assured her that love was what mattered, that everyone would get along beautifully. I'd even pretended not to notice when she'd forgotten to include my sister Ruth on the invitation list, only remembering when I'd mentioned it directly. "Oh, of course," she'd said with that bright smile that never quite reached her eyes. "I just assumed you'd handle your side of the family." When Sophia had been born, I'd been the one driving Carmen to her doctor's appointments during those last weeks of pregnancy because Daniel couldn't get time off work. I'd sat in hospital waiting rooms, held her hand during contractions, and been the first person after Daniel to hold my granddaughter. I'd stocked their freezer with meals for after they came home, organized a meal train with the other mothers from Daniel's high school class, and had quietly handled the thank you notes for all the baby gifts because Carmen was too overwhelmed to deal with them. But somewhere along the way, my helpfulness had transformed into interference in her eyes. My experience had become unwanted. Advice. My love for my granddaughter had become overstepping boundaries. When I'd suggested that maybe Sophia seemed hungry between her scheduled feeding times, Carmen had snapped that I was undermining her parenting. When I'd offered to babysit, so they could have a date night, she'd told Daniel that she didn't trust anyone else with her baby. When I'd bought Sophia a beautiful little dress for her first birthday, Carmen had returned it and told me that they were trying to avoid gender stereotypes in clothing choices. Each rejection had stung, but I'd told myself it was normal new mother protectiveness. I'd backed off, waited for invitations instead of offering help, asked permission before buying gifts. I'd turned myself inside out, trying to be the kind of mother-in-law that Carmen could accept, the kind that didn't threaten her position as the woman in Daniel's life. But apparently, even my attempts to stay out of the way were too much for her. The cruelest part was the timing. Just 3 days earlier, I'd received news that my mammogram had come back with some areas of concern that needed further testing. I hadn't told anyone yet, not Daniel, not my sister Ruth, not even my best friend Margaret. I'd been sitting with that fear alone, the way you do when you're trying to protect the people you love from worrying unnecessarily. The follow-up appointment was scheduled for next week, and I'd been telling myself it was probably nothing, just dense tissue or a cyst, the kind of false alarm that happens to women my age all the time. But sitting there looking at Carmen's meme, the word cancer kept flashing through my mind like a neon sign. What if it wasn't nothing? What if the follow-up revealed something serious? What if, in some twisted way, Carmen's wish came true? The thought of her finding out about a diagnosis and thinking she'd somehow predicted it, or worse, caused it, made me feel sick to my stomach. I could practically hear her telling people how she'd known something was wrong because I'd been acting different lately, never mentioning that the only thing different about me was that I'd been trying harder to stay out of her way. I realized I was gripping my phone so tightly my knuckles had gone white. The screen had gone dark, but I could still see that meme burned into my retinas like you see camera flashes after someone takes your picture. When Grandma finally stops giving unsolicited advice, the words felt like they were carved into my forehead now, marking me as the kind of person whose death would be a relief rather than a loss. That's when something inside me shifted, like a tectonic plate moving deep underground before an earthquake. I wasn't going to sit here and cry over Carmen's cruelty. I wasn't going to call Daniel and put him in the middle of our conflict. I wasn't going to delete my social media account or pretend I hadn't seen it or try to take the high road. Carmen had chosen to make this public, to invite commentary, to turn my existence into a joke for her entertainment. Fine. But if she wanted to play games about death and inheritance, she was about to learn that she'd picked the wrong opponent. I opened the Facebook app and navigated to her post. The comment count had grown to 17 while I'd been sitting there processing what I was seeing. More of her friends had chimed in with laughing emojis and so true responses. Someone had even shared it to their own timeline with the comment, "This is why I moved 3 states away from my mother-in-law." The casual cruelty of it all, the way these strangers felt comfortable celebrating the idea of an elderly woman's death, made my blood pressure spike so high I could feel it pounding in my temples. But instead of anger, I felt something else rising, in my chest. Something cold and calculating and surprisingly powerful. Carmen had forgotten something important about me in her rush to turn me into a stereotype. I wasn't just Daniel's mother or Sophia's grandmother, or even just some random old woman whose opinions didn't matter. I was Dorothy Richardson, and I'd spent 40 years building a successful real estate business from nothing. I'd negotiated million-dollar deals, handled hostile clients, and survived 2 recessions without losing my shirt. I owned property, had investments, and yes, I had a will that Carmen had apparently never stopped to think about. More importantly, I had something Carmen wanted: access to my son and granddaughter, influence in family decisions, and eventually, a share of whatever I'd leave behind when I actually did die. She'd gotten so comfortable taking those things for granted that she'd forgotten they were gifts I chose to give, not rights she was entitled to. But if she wanted to joke about my death, she was about to learn exactly what that death might mean for her future. I placed my fingers on the keyboard and began to type. The morning Carmen became my daughter-in-law 3 years ago, I should have seen the warning signs. But I was so happy for Daniel, so relieved that my quiet, bookish son had found someone who seemed to adore him, that I overlooked the small cruelties that would eventually bloom into yesterday's meme. Looking back now, I can trace the pattern of disrespect that led us to this moment, each incident building on the last like layers of sediment-forming rock. It started with the wedding planning, though I didn't recognize it as the beginning of anything at the time. Carmen had asked me to help coordinate the vendors, and I'd thrown myself into the task with the enthusiasm of a woman who'd been waiting years to plan a wedding. I'd called florists, visited cake shops, and compiled spreadsheets comparing prices and packages. When Carmen mentioned wanting peonies for her bouquet, I'd driven to 4 different flower markets to find someone who could guarantee their availability in March. The first red flag should have been how she received my efforts. Instead of gratitude, there was always something wrong. The florist I'd found was too traditional. The cake samples I'd arranged were too sweet. The venue I'd suggested was not Instagram-worthy enough. Each critique was delivered with a smile, softened with phrases like, "I really appreciate all your work, but," or, "You've been so helpful, however." It took me months to realize that Carmen wasn't collaborating with me. She was using me as unpaid labor while maintaining complete control over every decision. The pattern became clearer during the venue selection process. I'd spent an entire Saturday driving Carmen to 3 different locations, taking notes, asking questions about catering restrictions and setup times. At each place, I'd watched her take photos and videos, documenting every detail with the thoroughness of a professional event planner. She'd seemed genuinely interested in my opinions, asking what I thought about the lighting, the acoustics, the parking situation. I'd felt useful, included, valued. But when we got home, she'd immediately called her mother. I'd been in the kitchen making us tea when I overheard her side of the conversation. "Mom, you were so right about the Riverside Country Club. It's perfect. I knew it was the one the moment we walked in." There was no mention of the day we'd spent together, no acknowledgement that I'd been the one to suggest Riverside in the first place after researching their packages online. In Carmen's version of events, she'd discovered the venue through her own brilliant instincts. The guest list incident should have been another wake-up call. Carmen had presented me with what she called the preliminary family section, a list of 12 people from Daniel's side, including immediate family and a few close relatives. Missing from the list were my sister Ruth, my brother Tom, and several cousins who'd been part of every major family celebration for decades. When I gently pointed out the omissions, Carmen had gotten that bright, brittle smile that I was beginning to recognize as her armor. "Oh, Dorothy, I know you're close to them, but we're trying to keep things intimate. Daniel said you'd understand." The fact that she'd discussed this with my son without including me in the conversation stung, but what hurt more was the implication that my family relationships were somehow less important than hers. Her side of the guest list included distant relatives, college friends she barely spoke to, and coworkers from 3 different jobs. But my sister, who'd helped raise Daniel after his father died, was considered expendable. I'd compromised, as I always did. We'd settled on inviting Ruth and Tom, but not the cousins, and I'd convinced myself that Carmen was just trying to manage costs and logistics. Young couples had to make difficult choices, I'd told myself. It wasn't personal. But Ruth had noticed the slight, and at the wedding she'd pulled me aside during the reception. "That girl doesn't see you as family," Ruth had said, watching Carmen hold court at the head table, surrounded by her bridesmaids. "She sees you as staff." I'd laughed it off at the time, told Ruth she was being dramatic, that every new marriage required adjustments. But Ruth had been a social worker for 30 years, and she was good at reading people. I should have listened to her. The real pattern of invisible labor began after Sophia was born. Carmen had developed what she called postpartum anxiety, which I'd tried to understand and support. She couldn't bear to leave the baby with anyone, couldn't relax unless she was personally overseeing every aspect of Sophia's care. I'd respected her feelings, even when they seemed excessive to me. But somehow, her anxiety never extended to having me do the unglamorous work that kept their household running. I'd found myself becoming their invisible support system without ever being asked directly. Carmen would mention in passing that they were out of groceries, and somehow I'd end up at the store picking up their weekly shopping. She'd sigh about not having time to meal prep with a new baby, and I'd find myself cooking double portions of everything and dropping off containers of soup and casseroles. When their washing machine broke, I'd offered to take their laundry home with me rather than leave them struggling with a newborn and dirty clothes. Each act of service had been my choice, motivated by love for my son and granddaughter and a genuine desire to help during a difficult transition. But Carmen had a way of receiving help that made it feel like an obligation rather than a gift. She never thanked me directly, Instead, she'd tell other people how helpful I was being, as if my assistance was noteworthy precisely because it exceeded what could reasonably be expected from a mother-in-law. The grocery shopping arrangement had become particularly galling over time. What had started as an emergency favor during Sophia's first month had somehow become a weekly routine. Carmen would text me her list, not ask if I could shop for them, just send the list with items like organic free-range chicken breast, artisanal sourdough bread, and cold-pressed green juice. The brands were always specified, often expensive, and frequently available only at specialty stores across town. I'd realized the full extent of my invisible labor one afternoon when I'd been carrying their groceries up to their front porch. 3 heavy bags that had cost me nearly $200. Carmen had opened the door wearing yoga pants and a fresh face of makeup, clearly having just finished an exercise video in their living room. "Oh, perfect, Dorothy. You're a lifesaver. I was just thinking I needed to figure out dinner." She'd taken the bags without offering to reimburse me, without asking about my day, without acknowledging that I'd spent 2 hours of my afternoon and a significant portion of my grocery budget on their needs. But what had really stung was seeing her post about it later on social media. A artfully arranged photo of the organic produce I'd purchased, with the caption, "So grateful for fresh, healthy ingredients. Taking care of my family's nutrition is such a labor of love. Mom life. Josh, organic, blessed." 36 people had liked and commented, praising Carmen for being such a dedicated mother and wife. There was no mention of who had actually shopped for, paid for, and delivered those ingredients. The babysitting situation had followed a similar pattern of invisible expectation. Carmen's anxiety about leaving Sophia with strangers never seemed to extend to leaving her with me. I'd become their default childcare, the person they called when they wanted to go out to dinner, attend work events, or just have an afternoon to themselves. But I was never asked in advance, never given the courtesy of being able to plan my own schedule around their needs. Instead, Carmen would call with that breathless urgency that made refusal seem cruel. "Dorothy, I'm so sorry to ask last minute, but Daniel's boss invited us to this work dinner and it could be really important for his career. Could you possibly watch Sophia tonight? I know it's short notice, but you're the only person I trust with her. How could I say no to helping my son's career advancement? How could I refuse to care for my granddaughter when framed as an act of trust?" But trust, I'd begun to realize, was a convenient fiction when it came to Carmen's relationship with me. She trusted me to provide free labor, free groceries, free childcare, and free emotional support. She trusted me to be available whenever needed, to prioritize their needs over my own plans, to absorb the costs and inconveniences that came with their choices. But she didn't trust me to have opinions about how they lived their lives, didn't trust my experience or wisdom, and certainly didn't trust me to deserve acknowledgement for the role I played in keeping their household running smoothly. The advice-giving incidents that had apparently inspired yesterday's meme had been particularly frustrating because they'd grown out of genuine concern rather than nosiness. When I'd suggested that Sophia seemed hungry between her scheduled feedings, it was because I'd watched my granddaughter root desperately at Carmen's shirt, cry inconsolably for 20 minutes, and then immediately settle when finally allowed to nurse. When I'd mentioned that the baby might sleep better in a slightly warmer room, it was because I'd noticed Sophia's hands were always cold, and she startled awake frequently. These weren't random opinions offered for my own entertainment. They were observations based on 40 years of experience with children, including 3 of my own and dozens of babysitting clients during my early married years. But Carmen had received each suggestion as a personal attack, a criticism of her mothering abilities, rather than helpful input from someone who wanted the best for both her and the baby. The breaking point had come 3 months ago during what I now think of as the Great Organic Formula incident. Sophia had been crying for hours, refusing to nurse, clearly distressed about something. Carmen had been on the verge of tears herself, exhausted and overwhelmed. I'd gently suggested that sometimes babies go through growth spurts where breast milk alone isn't enough, that supplementing with formula for a few days might help everyone get some rest. Carmen's reaction had been swift and vicious. "I should have known you'd suggest poison," she'd snapped, her voice loud enough to wake the baby from the brief doze she'd finally fallen into. "Just because your generation didn't know any better doesn't mean I'm going to compromise my daughter's health with chemical-filled garbage." She'd gone on to list the various ways that formula was apparently destroying children's immune systems, digestive health, and even their intellectual development. I'd stood there holding my crying granddaughter, listening to my daughter-in-law essentially call me an ignorant old woman who'd endangered my own children through poor choices. The cruelty of it had taken my breath away. Not just the attack on my parenting, but the complete dismissal of my concerns for Sophia's well-being. In Carmen's mind, I wasn't a loving grandmother trying to help. I was an obstacle to her. Perfect motherhood, a relic from a less enlightened time whose input was not just unwelcome, but actively harmful. That night, Daniel had called to smooth things over. His approach had been to minimize both sides of the conflict, treating it as a simple misunderstanding between two women who both loved Sophia. "Mom, you know Carmen's just really passionate about doing everything right for the baby. And Carmen, you know Mom just wants to help. Can't we all just get along?" His refusal to acknowledge that one of us had been cruel while the other had been trying to help felt like a betrayal almost as sharp as Carmen's attack. I'd begun to realize that in Daniel's mind, keeping the peace meant that I had to absorb whatever treatment Carmen chose to dish out. If she was rude, I needed to understand that she was stressed. If she was ungrateful, I needed to remember that she was overwhelmed. If she was dismissive, I needed to consider that she was just trying to establish her independence as a wife and mother. My feelings, my dignity, my contributions to their lives, these were all expendable in service of maintaining harmony in Daniel's household. The pattern had been building for 3 years, each incident teaching Carmen that she could treat me however she chose without consequence. I'd absorbed her slights, excused her behavior, and continued to provide support because I loved my son and granddaughter. But yesterday's meme had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Carmen hadn't just been rude or dismissive. She'd been actively cruel, turning my existence into entertainment for her friends, reducing me to a stereotype whose death would be cause for celebration rather than mourning. As I sat in my kitchen, that Tuesday morning staring at my phone screen, I realized that I'd spent 3 years training Carmen to disrespect me. Every time I'd swallowed an insult, ignored a slight, or provided help without acknowledgement, I'd taught her that my feelings didn't matter. Every time I'd prioritized keeping the peace over demanding basic courtesy, I'd shown her that she could treat me however she chose without losing access to my time, money, or childcare services. But Carmen had made one crucial miscalculation in posting that meme. She'd forgotten that the power dynamic in our relationship wasn't actually tilted in her favor. Yes, she controlled access to my son and granddaughter, but I controlled something far more tangible: my resources, my time, and ultimately, my estate. She'd gotten so comfortable taking my contributions for granted that she'd forgotten they were choices I made, not obligations I owed. The comment I was about to post would change everything between us. There would be no going back to the old pattern of invisible labor and absorbed insults. Carmen had chosen to make our conflict public, and I was about to show her exactly what that kind of visibility could cost her. The weight of Carmen's disrespect had been accumulating like snow on a roof, each incident adding another layer until the structure of our relationship could barely support the load. What I hadn't fully grasped until that Tuesday morning was how systematically she'd been positioning herself as the victim of my existence, carefully crafting a narrative where every interaction between us cast her as the long-suffering daughter-in-law, and me as the overbearing mother-in-law who couldn't take a hint. The grocery shopping had evolved from emergency assistance into something that felt increasingly like indentured servitude. What had started as me offering to pick up a few essentials during Sophia's first weeks had morphed into Carmen texting me detailed shopping lists every Sunday evening, complete with brand specifications, store preferences, and dietary restrictions. That seemed to multiply weekly. She'd developed an intolerance to conventional produce, a sensitivity to anything not locally sourced, and a philosophical objection to supporting any company that didn't align with her evolving ethical standards. Last month's list had included items like grass-fed ghee from a specific farm in Vermont, heirloom tomatoes from the farmer's market that only operated on Wednesday mornings, and a particular brand of coconut milk that was only available at the health food store 20 miles across town. The shopping had taken me nearly 4 hours and cost over $300. But when I delivered the bags to their front door, Carmen had frowned at the receipt. "Oh, Dorothy, I meant the other coconut milk, the one in the blue can, not the green one. This brand has too much gar gum." She'd said it as if I should have somehow intuited her preference despite her text clearly specifying organic coconut milk, full fat. When I'd offered to return it and get the correct brand, she'd waved dismissively. "Don't worry about it. I'll just have to make do, I suppose." That phrase, "make do," had echoed in my head for days afterward. As if my 4 hours of driving, around town my $300, my careful attention to her specifications had resulted in such an inadequate outcome that she was now forced to lower her standards. The martyrdom in her voice, the suggestion that my efforts had somehow fallen short despite my following her instructions to the letter, had left me feeling simultaneously angry and confused. But the grocery shopping was just one thread in a larger tapestry of increasing demands. Carmen had also begun asking me to handle various household tasks that she claimed were too overwhelming to manage with a baby. I'd found myself picking up their dry cleaning, waiting for repair technicians at their house, and even handling correspondence with their homeowners association when neighbors complained about their lawn maintenance. Each request came wrapped in language that made refusal seem heartless. "Dorothy, I hate to ask, but the HOA is being so unreasonable about the grass height, and I'm just so exhausted from being up all night with Sophia. Could you possibly call them? You're so much better at dealing with difficult people than I am." How could I refuse to make a phone call when framed as helping my sleep-deprived daughter-in-law? How could I let my son's family face potential fines when I had the time and experience to resolve the situation? But what had really begun to grate on me was how Carmen presented these arrangements to other people. During a family barbecue at my brother Tom's house, I'd overheard her talking to his wife about how blessed she felt to have such a helpful mother-in-law. "Dorothy is just amazing," she'd gushed to Linda. "She's always offering to run errands for us, always wanting to help out. I keep telling her she doesn't need to do so much, but you know how mothers can be. They just can't help themselves." The implication was that I was some kind of compulsive helper, a woman so desperate to feel needed that I'd inserted myself into their lives despite Carmen's attempts to maintain appropriate boundaries. She'd painted my assistance as my own psychological need rather than her ongoing requests, making herself look gracious for tolerating my supposed overwhelming desire to be involved in their affairs. Later that same evening, when Linda had complimented me on being such a supportive mother-in-law, I'd felt a strange disconnection from the praise. "Carmen's so lucky to have you," Linda had said warmly. "Not everyone gets along so well with their in-laws." I'd smiled and nodded, playing the role of the devoted mother-in-law. But inside, I'd been calculating the hours I'd spent that week alone on Carmen's various requests. 14 hours of grocery shopping, errand running, and household management, none of which I'd volunteered for, all of which had been presented to my family as examples of my generous nature. The childcare expectations had followed a similar pattern of escalation. What had begun as occasional babysitting had become Carmen's default solution for any social or professional obligation. She'd started calling me her backup plan, a phrase that made me feel like a service rather than a family member. Thank goodness for Dorothy, she'd tell other mothers at the park. I don't know what I'd do without my backup plan. But backup plans, I'd begun to realize, were only activated in emergencies. Carmen's emergencies had become increasingly broad in definition. Date nights were emergencies because couples need to maintain their connection. Girls' nights were emergencies because new mothers need social support. Shopping trips were emergencies because I desperately need clothes that fit properly. Exercise classes were emergencies because physical fitness is crucial for mental health. Each emergency required immediate childcare, and each request came with elaborate explanations about why the timing couldn't be adjusted and why I was the only suitable caregiver. I know it's last minute, Dorothy, but this yoga class is the only one that fits my schedule, and you know how I feel about leaving Sophia with strangers. You're the only person I completely trust with her. The trust language had been particularly manipulative, I'd come to understand. Carmen didn't trust me enough to take my advice about feeding schedules or room temperature, didn't trust me enough to include me in family decisions, didn't trust me enough to treat me with basic courtesy. But she trusted me enough to provide free childcare whenever her life required it. Trust, in Carmen's vocabulary, was a one-way street that ran directly toward her convenience. The breaking point with the childcare had come 6 weeks ago when Carmen had called me on a Saturday morning, her voice tight with what sounded like panic. Dorothy, I need a huge favor. Daniel's company is having this surprise team-building event today, and spouses are invited, but they specifically said no children. I know you probably have plans, but could you possibly watch Sophia? It's really important for Daniel's career. I'd rearranged my entire day, canceled lunch with Margaret, postponed a hair appointment I'd been looking forward to for weeks, and rushed over to their house with barely enough time to gather my things. When I'd arrived, Carmen had been in full crisis mode, frantically searching for the right outfit while explaining how crucial this event was for Daniel's professional relationships. You're literally saving our lives, she'd said, kissing Sophia goodbye with theatrical reluctance. I don't know what we'd do without you. Daniel had hugged me with genuine gratitude, and I'd felt that familiar warmth of being needed, of making a meaningful contribution to my family's success. But when I'd picked up the newspaper the next morning, I'd seen a photo from the surprise team-building event in the local business section. The article was about corporate community involvement, featuring several local companies that had participated in a charity fundraiser. The event had been planned for months, according to the piece, with companies signing up their teams in advance and promoting the participation internally for weeks. Carmen had lied to me about the surprise nature of the event, had created artificial urgency to manipulate me into providing childcare, and had done it so smoothly that I'd never questioned her story. The realization that she was willing to lie to secure my services had felt like a physical blow, a betrayal that went beyond mere thoughtlessness into active deception. When I'd confronted her about it the following week, she'd been ready with explanations. Oh, Dorothy, I think there was some confusion. Daniel only told me about it last minute, so it felt like a surprise to us. I wasn't trying to mislead you. But her eyes had that same brittle brightness I'd learned to recognize as her defensive armor, and she'd quickly changed the subject to how grateful they were for my flexibility. The financial expectations had been perhaps the most insidious part of the escalating demands. Carmen had never directly asked me for money, but she'd developed a sophisticated system of hints and implications that made her needs known without requiring her to explicitly request assistance. She'd mention in passing that Sophia's daycare costs were absolutely killing their budget, or that they were struggling to keep up with the mortgage payments on their house. These conversations always happened when I was already providing some form of help, while I was unpacking groceries I'd purchased for them, or during the handoff when I was returning Sophia after babysitting. The timing made it impossible to ignore the subtext that my financial assistance might be needed to maintain the lifestyle that allowed Carmen to request my time and services. The pattern had become most obvious around gift-giving occasions. Carmen had developed elaborate wish lists for Sophia's birthdays and holidays, filled with expensive items that she'd researched thoroughly and present as essential for the baby's development. The lists came with detailed explanations about why each item was important: the organic wooden blocks that would support fine motor skills, the handcrafted educational toys that would encourage creative thinking, the premium stroller that would ensure proper ergonomic support during walks. But when I'd purchased items from the lists, Carmen's responses had been underwhelming. The gifts were acknowledged with perfunctory thank you notes that read more like receipts than expressions of gratitude. "Thank you for the developmental blocks. Sophia will enjoy them when she's old enough." There was no warmth, no recognition of the thought or expense involved, just a clinical acknowledgement that the transaction had been completed. Meanwhile, gifts from Carmen's own family were celebrated with elaborate social media posts showcasing the items and praising the givers. When her sister had given Sophia a simple stuffed animal, Carmen had posted 3 photos of the baby with the toy, along with a caption about how Aunt Brenda always knows exactly what Sophia needs. The difference in treatment had been stark enough that my sister Ruth had noticed it during a family gathering. "Does Carmen ever seem genuinely happy to see you?" Ruth had asked me quietly while we'd watched Carmen fuss over a gift from her mother. A basic baby outfit that had probably cost less than the wooden blocks I'd given Sophia the previous week. "She lights up when her own family arrives. But with you, it's like she's tolerating a necessary inconvenience." I'd defended Carmen at the time, explaining that she was just more reserved with in-laws, that it took time to build close relationships across family lines. But Ruth's observation had planted a seed of awareness that had grown over the following months. Carmen did treat me differently than she treated her own family members. With them, she was warm, grateful, effusive in her appreciation. With me, she was polite, distant, and focused primarily on what I could provide rather than who I was as a person. The realization had come into sharp focus during Carmen's birthday celebration last month. I'd spent considerable time and money planning a surprise party for her, coordinating with Daniel to ensure all her favorite people could attend. I'd handled the invitations, ordered a custom cake from her preferred bakery, and decorated their house with flowers and balloons in the colors she'd mentioned liking. The party had been a success by all external measures. Carmen had seemed genuinely surprised and pleased. Her friends had praised the thoughtful details, and Daniel had been grateful for the effort I'd made to celebrate his wife. But throughout the evening, I'd felt like hired help rather than family. Carmen had introduced me to her friends as Daniel's mother, never using my name, never mentioning my role in organizing the celebration. When people had complimented the decorations or the cake, she'd accepted the praise without acknowledging who had actually planned and paid for everything. The final straw had been the thank you conversation the following day. Carmen had called to express her appreciation, but the call had felt more like a performance review than a family conversation. "The party was lovely, Dorothy. Very tasteful. I especially appreciated that you kept everything so understated. I was worried it might be too much, but you showed good restraint." Good restraint. As if my efforts to celebrate her birthday had been a test of my ability to stay within appropriate boundaries rather than an expression of love and welcome into our family. The phrase had echoed in my head for days, crystallizing my growing understanding that Carmen saw me not as a family member, but as a service provider whose performance needed to be managed and evaluated. Now, staring at that meme on my phone screen, I could see the full arc of our relationship with devastating clarity. Carmen had systematically trained me to provide increasingly extensive services while treating me with decreasing levels of respect. She'd established a dynamic where my contributions were expected rather than appreciated, where my time and money were resources for her use rather than gifts freely given. But most importantly, she'd miscalculated the source of power in our relationship. Carmen thought she held all the cards because she controlled access to Daniel and Sophia. She'd been confident enough in that power to publicly mock me, to turn my existence into entertainment for her friends, to suggest that my death would be a relief rather than a loss. What she'd forgotten was that power dynamics can shift quickly when someone decides they're no longer willing to play by the established rules. And I was about to show her exactly how quickly those rules could change. The moment that shattered my tolerance completely happened on a seemingly ordinary Thursday evening, 2 weeks before Carmen posted that meme. I'd been babysitting Sophia, while Daniel and Carmen attended what she'd described as a crucial networking event for her dental hygiene career. According to Carmen, this was a professional development seminar that could lead to advancement opportunities, and attending was essential for her future in the field. I'd arrived at their house at 5:30, prepared for what I'd been told would be a 3-hour commitment. Sophia had been fussy that day, running a low fever and refusing her afternoon nap. I'd spent the evening walking her around their living room, trying different techniques to soothe her discomfort while she cried. Inconsolably, by 8 o'clock I'd managed to get her to sleep, but she'd only stayed down for 20-minute intervals before waking up distressed again. At 10:30, when Daniel and Carmen still weren't home, I'd called Daniel's cell phone. It had gone, straight to voicemail, as had Carmen's. I'd tried texting both of them, explaining that Sophia seemed to be getting sicker and asking when they expected to return. No response. By 11:15, I'd been genuinely worried about both the baby's condition and my son's whereabouts. The seminar should have ended hours ago, and their silence was completely out of character. Finally, at nearly midnight, I'd heard their car in the driveway. Carmen had stumbled slightly coming up the front steps, laughing loudly at something Daniel was saying behind her. When they'd opened the door, the smell of alcohol had preceded them into the house like an announcement. They'd both been clearly intoxicated, not dangerously so, but well beyond the point of having attended any professional development event. "Oh, Dorothy!" Carmen had exclaimed with exaggerated surprise, as if she'd forgotten I was there watching their sick child. "You're still here! How was our little angel?" Her words had been slightly slurred, and she'd been wearing a dress I'd never seen before, something sparkly and inappropriate for a professional seminar, but perfect for a night out at bars. Daniel had looked embarrassed when he'd seen my expression, but Carmen had seemed oblivious to the gravity of the situation. She'd started chattering about what a wonderful evening they'd had, how important it had been for them to connect as a couple, and how grateful she was that I'd been available to watch Sophia. There had been no acknowledgement that they'd been gone for over 6 hours instead of the promised 3, no apology for not answering their phones when I'd tried to reach them about their sick child. But what had truly enraged me was what I'd discovered the next morning when I'd checked social media. Carmen had posted a series of photos from their evening, pictures of her and Daniel at an upscale restaurant, cocktails at a trendy bar, even a selfie from what appeared to be a nightclub. The captions told the real story of their professional development, evening, date night finally, and sometimes you just need to dance, and dinner without discussing diaper changes, heaven. She'd lied to me completely and deliberately. There had been no seminar, no networking event, no professional obligation that required my emergency childcare services. They'd simply wanted a night out, and Carmen had been unwilling to ask me directly, choosing instead to manufacture an elaborate fiction that would make refusal seem selfish and unsupportive. What made the betrayal even more painful was the timing. I'd spent that evening worrying about Sophia's health, feeling responsible for a sick baby while unable to reach her parents, questioning whether I should take her to urgent care or try to manage her fever at home. I'd been genuinely concerned about doing the right thing for my granddaughter, while Carmen had been posing for Instagram photos with cocktails. When I'd confronted Carmen about the deception the following week, she'd deployed her full arsenal of manipulation tactics. First, she'd claimed there had been a misunderstanding about the nature of the event. "I thought I mentioned it was a dinner meeting," she'd said, despite my having clear memory of her detailed explanation about the professional seminar. When I'd pressed her on the specific lies she'd told, she'd shifted to justification. "Dorothy, you have to understand how rarely Daniel and I get time alone together. Being new parents is so isolating, and we were both just desperate for a few hours to reconnect as a couple. I knew you'd want us to have that opportunity. You're always saying how important it is for marriages to stay strong after having children." The audacity of using my own words about the importance of strong marriages to justify her deception had left me speechless. She'd taken my general advice about couples needing time together and twisted it into retroactive permission for lying to secure free childcare. But she hadn't finished her defense. "Besides, you love spending time with Sophia, and she's always so good for you. It's not like we were asking you to do something you didn't enjoy. And honestly, if we'd told you it was just a date night, you might have felt obligated to say yes even if it was inconvenient, and we didn't want to put that pressure on you." This final piece of logic had been the most infuriating of all. Carmen had claimed that lying to me had actually been a kindness, protecting me from feeling pressured to provide childcare I might not want to give. She'd positioned her deception as consideration for my feelings, completely ignoring the reality that she'd manipulated me into providing services under false pretenses. But the restaurant receipt I'd found tucked under their kitchen counter told a different story about their financial priorities. The bill for their desperate need to reconnect had been over $400. Money spent on premium cocktails, expensive appetizers, and wine pairings while they'd asked me to cover their grocery expenses because their budget was so tight with the new baby. That receipt had crystallized something I'd been trying not to see for months. Carmen and Daniel weren't struggling financially. They were prioritizing their wants over their responsibilities and using my generosity to subsidize their lifestyle choices. The groceries I'd been buying, the restaurant meals I'd occasionally treated them to, the gifts I'd purchased for Sophia, all of this had been freeing up their money for entertainment and luxury items rather than helping a young family get established. The pattern had become even clearer when I'd started paying attention to their spending habits. Carmen's social media was full of photos showcasing new purchases, designer handbags, expensive skincare products, trendy home decor items. She'd developed what she called her self-care budget, which apparently included monthly spa treatments, regular hair appointments at high-end salons, and a seemingly endless collection of workout clothes for her various fitness pursuits. Meanwhile, she'd continued to present their financial situation to me as precarious. Just the week before the restaurant incident, she'd sighed dramatically while looking at their utility bill, mentioning how overwhelming it was to manage all these expenses with a new baby. The implication had been clear, that my continued assistance with groceries and other household expenses was necessary for their stability. But the utility bill she'd been lamenting was sitting on their kitchen counter next to a shopping bag from an expensive boutique clothing store. When she'd stepped out of the room to change Sophia's diaper, I'd glanced at the receipt tucked inside the bag. $250 for a single blouse that she'd described on Instagram as a little treat to help me feel human again, after months of mom clothes. The cognitive dissonance had been staggering. Carmen had been simultaneously claiming financial hardship and making luxury purchases that exceeded what many families spent on groceries for an entire week. She'd been accepting my financial assistance while spending frivolously, treating my contributions as supplemental income rather than emergency support. But perhaps the most galling discovery had been the vacation they'd booked without mentioning it to me. I'd only found out about their plans when Carmen had casually asked if I'd be available to watch Sophia for a long weekend the following month. When I'd asked about their plans, she'd mentioned visiting her college roommate in California, describing it as a much-needed break from the stresses of new parenthood. What she hadn't mentioned was that this visit with a friend was actually a 4-day stay at a luxury resort in Napa Valley. I'd only discovered the truth when her college roommate had posted photos of their reunion on Facebook, tagging Carmen in pictures from wine tastings, spa treatments, and expensive restaurants. The resort they'd stayed at charged over $500 per night, and their activities had clearly cost thousands of dollars. While I'd been watching their child for free, believing I was helping a struggling young couple get a brief respite from parenting pressures, they'd been enjoying a vacation that cost more than many families earn in a month, and they'd funded this luxury getaway partially through the money they'd saved by having me cover their grocery bills, household expenses, and childcare needs. The final insult had been Carmen's phone call from California, ostensibly to check on Sophia but actually to share details about their amazing trip. She'd described the wine tastings, the couple's massage, the gourmet meals, all while I'd been dealing with a teething baby who'd been crying for hours. "This is exactly what we needed," she'd gushed. "Sometimes you just have to invest in your relationship, you know? The baby will be fine, but if the parents aren't taking care of themselves, the whole family suffers." The irony of her talking about investing in their relationship while I'd been providing free labor to make that investment possible had been almost comical. Carmen had been lecturing me about the importance of self-care and relationship maintenance while I'd been sacrificing my own time and comfort to enable their luxury vacation. But what had really crystallized my understanding of our dynamic was something I'd overheard during that same phone call. Carmen had apparently thought she'd hung up, but I'd still been connected when she'd started talking to Daniel about their trip home. "Your mom is so predictable," she'd said, her voice clear through the phone speaker. I knew she'd be available to watch Sophia, and I knew she wouldn't ask too many questions about where we were going. "She's just so desperate to feel needed." The phrase, "desperate to feel needed," had hit me like a physical blow. In Carmen's mind, my willingness to help wasn't generosity or love. It was emotional neediness that she could exploit for her convenience. She'd reduced my maternal instincts and family loyalty to a character flaw that made me easy to manipulate. Even worse, she'd continued talking, apparently unaware that I could hear every word. "Sometimes I feel bad about how much she does for us, but honestly, if she didn't have us to take care of, what else would she do with her time? At least this way, she feels useful. It's probably good for her to have a purpose." The condescension in her voice had been breathtaking. Carmen had convinced herself that accepting my help was actually a favor to me, that allowing me to serve their needs was a form of charity that gave meaning to my otherwise empty life. She'd transformed my generosity into evidence of my pathetic need for relevance, my love into proof of my desperation. That conversation had played on repeat in my mind for weeks afterward, coloring every subsequent interaction between us. When Carmen had called asking for help with grocery shopping, I'd heard desperate to feel needed. When she'd requested emergency babysitting, I'd heard predictable and easy to manipulate. When she'd accepted my assistance without gratitude, I'd heard doing her a favor by giving her purpose. The meme she'd posted was just the public expression of an attitude she'd held privately for months, maybe years. In Carmen's world, I wasn't a person deserving of respect. I was a resource, to be managed, a service to be utilized, a problem to be solved. My death wouldn't be a loss because my life had never been valuable to her in the first place. But sitting in my kitchen that Tuesday morning, staring at her cruel joke about my demise, I'd realized that Carmen had made one crucial error in her assessment of our relationship. She'd assumed that my willingness to help came from weakness, that my generosity was evidence of desperation, that my love for my family made me infinitely exploitable. What she'd failed to understand was that strength can look like service, that power can be exercised through giving rather than taking, and that someone who's been generous by choice can choose to stop being generous at any time. Carmen had gotten so comfortable taking my contributions for granted that she'd forgotten. They were gifts I chose to give, not obligations I owed. She was about to learn the difference. The clarity that washed over me as I stared at Carmen's meme felt like emerging from underwater after being submerged for too long. Every breath seemed sharper, every detail of my kitchen more vivid, as if I'd been living in a fog that had suddenly lifted. For 3 years, I'd been operating under the assumption that Carmen's treatment of me was somehow normal, that the constant demands and casual disrespect were just part of the adjustment period that comes with new family dynamics. But seeing my hypothetical death turned into entertainment for her social media friends had stripped away all the comfortable delusions I'd been maintaining about our relationship. The phone felt heavier in my hands as I began to understand the full scope of what had been happening to me. This wasn't just about a daughter-in-law who was still learning how to navigate family relationships, or a young mother who was overwhelmed and occasionally thoughtless. Carmen had been systematically erasing my personhood, reducing me to a collection of services that existed for her convenience. The meme wasn't an isolated incident of poor judgment. It was the logical conclusion of a worldview that had never seen me as fully human. I thought about all the conversations I'd had with other women my age, the gentle complaints about demanding adult children or difficult in-laws that were shared over coffee or during book club meetings. "Oh, you know how it is," we'd say to each other, accompanied by rueful smiles and resigned shrugs. Family is family. But what I was experiencing went far beyond the normal challenges of intergenerational relationships. Carmen hadn't just been taking advantage of my generosity. She'd been actively conditioning me to accept increasingly degrading treatment while convincing me that my acceptance was evidence of my love for my family. The manipulation had been so skillful that I'd become complicit in my own diminishment. Every time I'd swallowed an insult or ignored a slight, I'd reinforced Carmen's belief that she could treat me however she chose without consequence. Every time I'd provided assistance without acknowledgement, I'd taught her that my contributions were expected rather than appreciated. Every time I'd prioritized keeping the peace over demanding basic respect, I'd confirmed her assessment that I was too desperate to feel needed to ever push back against her behavior. But the most insidious part of Carmen's manipulation had been the way she'd made me doubt my own perceptions. When I'd felt hurt by her dismissiveness, she'd implied that I was being oversensitive. When I'd tried to address her ingratitude, she'd suggested that I was expecting too much recognition for simple family support. When I'd questioned her demands on my time and resources, she'd made me feel selfish for not being more generous with people I claimed to love. She'd been particularly skilled at using my own values against me. Carmen knew that I believed in putting family first, in being generous with those you love, in maintaining harmony within the household. She'd weaponized these beliefs, turning them into tools for manipulation rather than expressions of genuine care. When I'd hesitated to provide some service or assistance, she'd remind me of my own stated commitment to family solidarity. When I'd shown any sign of resentment, she'd point out how my attitude was creating conflict that hurt everyone, especially Sophia. The psychological conditioning had been so effective that I'd begun to monitor my own thoughts and feelings, censoring any reaction that might be seen as selfish or unreasonable. When Carmen had been rude to me, I'd immediately searched for explanations that would justify her behavior. She was tired, stressed, overwhelmed, adjusting to motherhood. When she'd been ungrateful for my help, I'd reminded myself that gratitude shouldn't be the motivation for generosity, that truly selfless giving expected nothing in return. I'd twisted myself into knots trying to be the kind of mother-in-law who deserved love and respect, not understanding that Carmen had already decided I was unworthy of both, regardless of how I behaved. She'd been operating from a fundamental assumption that I was an obstacle to be managed rather than a person to be valued, and no amount of self-improvement or generous service was going to change that basic framework. The coffee in my mug had grown cold as I'd sat there processing these realizations, but I barely noticed. My entire understanding of the past 3 years was reshuffling itself like cards being dealt for a new game. Incidents I'd dismissed as minor misunderstandings took on new significance when viewed through the lens of systematic disrespect. Conversations I'd replayed obsessively, wondering what I'd done wrong, suddenly made perfect sense when I understood that the problem wasn't my behavior. It was Carmen's fundamental lack of regard for my dignity as a human being. The birthday party incident from 6 months ago, which I'd tried so hard to rationalize at the time, now appeared in its true light. Carmen had insisted on having Sophia's first birthday celebration at their house rather than mine, despite my larger backyard and better facilities for entertaining. She'd claimed it was about creating memories in Sophia's own home, but I'd ended up doing all the preparation work anyway, shopping for decorations, preparing food, setting up tables and chairs, coordinating with guests. During the actual party, I'd spent the entire time serving other people while Carmen had played the role of gracious hostess, accepting compliments on the beautiful decorations and delicious food without mentioning who had actually provided them. When her friends had praised the homemade cake, she'd smiled and thanked them as if she'd spent hours baking and decorating it herself. When guests had commented on the thoughtful party favors, she'd accepted their admiration for her creativity and attention to detail. At the time, I'd told myself that it didn't matter who got credit, that the important thing was Sophia having a lovely celebration surrounded by people who loved her. But now I could see the incident for what it really was. Carmen had used my labor to enhance her own social standing while simultaneously erasing my contributions from the narrative. She'd wanted the benefits of having a helpful mother-in-law, without having to acknowledge my role in making those benefits possible. The pattern had repeated itself at every major family gathering since then. I'd provide the work, Carmen would receive the praise, and I'd console myself with the knowledge that I was contributing to my family's happiness. But my happiness, my recognition, my basic dignity had never factored into Carmen's calculations. She'd been perfectly content to let me exhaust myself in service to her image as long as I didn't expect any acknowledgement for my efforts. Even more troubling was how she'd begun to rewrite history to suit her preferred narrative. Carmen had started telling people that I was always offering to help with various tasks, as if my assistance was something I'd imposed on them rather than something they'd requested. She'd described my grocery shopping as me being sweet, but a little overwhelming in my desire to help. She'd characterized my babysitting as evidence that I just couldn't stay away from Sophia, painting my childcare as my own emotional need rather than their practical necessity. This revision of our dynamic had been particularly evident during a conversation I'd overheard between Carmen and her sister Brenda 3 months ago. They'd been talking in Carmen's kitchen while I'd been in the adjacent living room reading to Sophia, and their voices had carried clearly through the doorway. "Daniel's mom is just so involved," Carmen had said with that particular tone that managed to sound both affectionate and exasperated. "I mean, I appreciate everything she does, but sometimes I wish she'd just relax and let us figure things out on our own. She's always shopping for us, always offering to babysit, always wanting to help with something. I think she's lonely since her husband died, and taking care of us gives her something to focus on." The casual cruelty of that assessment had taken my breath away. Carmen had transformed my every gesture of love and support into evidence of my pathetic emotional neediness. In her version of events, I wasn't a generous family member who wanted to help during a challenging life transition. I was a lonely widow desperately clinging to relevance by making myself indispensable to my son's family. Brenda's response had been even worse. "Oh God, that's so sad but also kind of annoying. Like, doesn't she have her own life? Maybe you need to start setting some boundaries before she gets too dependent on you guys for her social interaction." They'd been discussing me like I was a stray animal that had started hanging around their property, well-meaning but ultimately burdensome, requiring management rather than appreciation. The idea that I might have my own full life, my own interests, my own social connections, had never occurred to either of them. In their minds, My willingness to help could only be explained by personal desperation rather than familial love. But what had really shattered me was Carmen's response to her sister's suggestion about boundaries. I know I should probably say something, but honestly, the help is pretty convenient, and Daniel would be upset if I hurt his mom's feelings. So I just try to be gracious about it and redirect her energy toward useful things. At least if she's grocery shopping for us, she's not giving me parenting advice. The calculated manipulation in that statement had been breathtaking. Carmen had been deliberately managing my emotional needs to maximize the benefits to herself while minimizing any inconvenience. She'd figured out exactly how to keep me providing services without having to treat me with genuine respect or gratitude. I was being handled, managed, manipulated, not loved or valued or even liked. Now, sitting in my kitchen staring at that meme, I understood that every interaction I'd had with Carmen over the past 3 years had been filtered through this. Fundamental contempt for my worth as a person. She'd never seen me as Daniel's mother, Sophia's grandmother, or even just Dorothy Richardson, a woman with her own thoughts, feelings, and dignity. I'd been categorized as a resource to be exploited, and the only question had been how to do so most efficiently. The meme wasn't an aberration or a moment of poor judgment. It was the natural expression of someone who'd never considered my feelings important enough to monitor. Carmen had posted that image because she genuinely didn't see me as someone whose emotional well-being mattered. In her mind, I existed to serve her needs, and those needs didn't include being treated with basic human decency. But as I sat there processing the full scope of her disregard, something unexpected began to happen. Instead of the crushing despair I might have expected, I felt a strange sense of liberation. For 3 years, I'd been trying to solve a puzzle that had no solution: how to earn love and respect from someone who was fundamentally incapable of offering either. I'd blamed myself for every slight, questioned my own reactions to every insult, and contorted myself trying to become worthy of basic courtesy from someone who would never see me as worthy of anything. The clarity was almost euphoric. I wasn't the problem. I never had been. Carmen's treatment of me wasn't a reflection of my failures as a mother-in-law or my inadequacies as a person. It was a reflection of her character, her values, and her capacity for empathy. And if she was incapable of seeing me as fully human, then I was wasting my energy trying to prove my humanity to her. More importantly, I was beginning to understand that I had far more power in this relationship than I'd realized. Carmen had been so focused on exploiting my generosity that she'd forgotten I had choices. I could choose to stop providing services that weren't appreciated. I could choose to redirect my time and energy toward people who valued my contributions. And I could choose to stop protecting Carmen from the consequences of her own cruelty. The meme she'd posted was going to be the last time Carmen treated me with public disrespect, because it was going to be the catalyst for a complete restructuring of our relationship. She'd wanted to joke about my death, to turn my hypothetical demise into entertainment for her friends. Fine. But she was about to learn that there were aspects of my very much alive existence that she'd taken for granted and losing access to. Those aspects was going to be far more inconvenient than she'd ever imagined. My fingers moved to the keyboard, steady and certain for the first time in years. My best friend Margaret had been trying to get me to see a therapist for over a year, ever since she'd watched me cancel our lunch plans for the 3rd time in a month to handle one of Carmen's emergencies. I'd always dismissed her suggestions with the standard excuses. Therapy was too expensive, I didn't have time, my problems weren't serious enough to warrant professional help. But the real reason I'd avoided it was that some part of me had suspected a therapist would tell me exactly what Margaret had been hinting at for months, that my relationship with Carmen was profoundly unhealthy, and that I was allowing myself to be systematically abused by someone who should have been treating me like family. The morning after I posted my comment about updating my will, Margaret called me before 8 a.m. She'd seen the Facebook exchange, and her voice had an urgency I'd rarely heard from her. Dorothy, what happened? I saw Carmen's post and your response, and I'm honestly worried about you. Can we meet for coffee this morning? I think we need to talk. An hour later, I was sitting across from Margaret at our usual spot in the corner booth at Stella's Diner, watching her face cycle through shock, anger, and something that looked like relief as I told her about the meme and everything that had led up to it. Margaret had known about some of the issues with Carmen, the constant requests for help, the lack of gratitude, the occasional sharp comments, but I'd never shared the full extent of what had been happening. Dorothy, she said when I finished, explaining about the fake networking event and the overheard phone conversation about me being desperate to feel needed. This isn't just a difficult daughter-in-law situation. This is emotional abuse. Carmen has been systematically breaking down your sense of self-worth and manipulating you into accepting treatment that no one should have to tolerate from anyone, let alone family. The word abuse hung in the air between us like smoke from a fire. I'd never applied that term to my relationship with Carmen, partly because abuse was something that happened to other people, women in obviously toxic marriages, children with clearly dysfunctional parents. Middle-class grandmothers who lived in nice houses and had successful adult children weren't supposed to be victims of abuse. But as Margaret continued talking, I began to recognize patterns I'd been deliberately blind to for years. She's been isolating you emotionally, Margaret explained, her voice gentle but firm. Every time you've tried to express hurt or frustration, she's made you feel like you're being unreasonable. She's convinced you that your feelings don't matter, that your only value is in what you can provide for her. And now she's moved into public humiliation, testing how far she can push you before you finally push back. Margaret had pulled out her phone and was showing me articles about emotional abuse in family relationships, highlighting passages that described exactly what I'd been experiencing. Look at this checklist, Dorothy. Dismissing your feelings and concerns. Check. Making you feel like you're asking for too much when you want basic respect. Check. Using your love for family members to manipulate you into accepting poor treatment. Check. Gradually increasing demands while decreasing appreciation. Check, check, check. As I read through the descriptions of emotional manipulation tactics, I felt that same sense of clarity I'd experienced looking at Carmen's meme, but amplified. Every technique was familiar, every pattern recognizable. Carmen had been following a textbook approach to breaking down my resistance to poor treatment, and she'd been doing it so skillfully that I'd never recognized it as a deliberate strategy. The thing about emotional abusers, Margaret continued, is that they're often very charming to outside observers. They know how to present themselves as reasonable, caring people who are simply dealing with difficult family members. Carmen probably has a whole narrative about you that makes her the long-suffering daughter-in-law, and you the overbearing mother-in-law who just doesn't know when to back off. The accuracy of that assessment was devastating. I could practically hear Carmen explaining our relationship to her friends and family, painting herself as patient and gracious while dealing with my overwhelming need to be involved in their lives. She'd probably shared carefully edited versions of our conflicts, leaving out her lies and manipulations while emphasizing any moment when I'd expressed frustration or hurt. Margaret had insisted on driving me to see Dr. Sarah Chen, a therapist who specialized in family dynamics and emotional abuse recovery. Dr. Chen's office was nothing like what I'd expected. No couch, no intimidating diplomas covering the walls, just two comfortable chairs facing each other in a room filled with plants and soft natural light. Dr. Chen herself was younger than I'd anticipated, maybe in her early 40s, with kind eyes and an immediate warmth that made me feel less defensive about being there. Margaret told me a little about what's been happening with your daughter-in-law, Dr. Chen said after we'd settled into our chairs, but I'd like to hear your perspective on the relationship and what brought you here today. I'd started with the meme, thinking it would be easier to explain the immediate crisis than to delve into years of smaller incidents. But Dr. Chen had asked gentle questions that had drawn out the broader pattern, and before I knew it, I was telling her everything. The escalating demands, the financial manipulation, the lies about emergencies, the systematic erasure of my contributions to their family life. "Dorothy," Dr. Chen said when I'd finished, "what you're describing is a form of emotional abuse called instrumental exploitation. Carmen has been treating you as a means to an end rather than as a person with your own needs and dignity. She's identified your vulnerabilities, your love for your son and granddaughter, your desire to be helpful, your commitment to family harmony, and she's been using those vulnerabilities against you." The clinical terminology somehow made it easier to process what had been happening to me. This wasn't a personal failure on my part, or evidence that I was somehow inadequate as a mother-in-law. Carmen's behavior fit recognizable patterns that therapists and researchers had identified and studied. I wasn't alone in experiencing this kind of treatment, and more importantly, it wasn't my fault. One of the most insidious aspects of this type of abuse, Dr. Chen continued, is how it convinces victims that they're responsible for the mistreatment they're receiving. The abuser creates a narrative where the victim's reactions to abuse, hurt, frustration, attempts to set boundaries, are framed as evidence of the victim's unreasonableness or instability. She'd asked me to think about how Carmen typically responded when I'd tried to address problems in our relationship. The pattern was always the same: deflection, minimization, and redirection back to my supposed oversensitivity. If I'd mentioned feeling unappreciated, Carmen would remind me that she'd thanked me just last week for something, implying that I was keeping score in an unhealthy way. If I'd questioned the frequency of her requests for help, she'd express hurt that I saw family support as burdensome rather than joyful. What Carmen has been doing, Dr. Chen explained, is called DARVO: deny, attack, reverse victim, and offender. She denies that her behavior is problematic, attacks your character or motivations for bringing it up, and then positions herself as the real victim of your unreasonable expectations or oversensitive reactions. The acronym gave me a framework for understanding conversations that had left me feeling confused and guilty for days afterward. Carmen wasn't just bad at handling conflict. She was actively using psychological manipulation techniques to avoid accountability for her treatment of me. Every time I'd walked away from one of our confrontations feeling like I'd been unreasonable or too demanding, it had been because she'd successfully deployed these tactics to reverse our roles. Dr. Chen had given me homework for our next session: to keep a journal documenting every interaction with Carmen, noting not just what happened but how I felt before, during, and after each encounter. The exercise was designed to help me recognize the emotional impact of her behavior, and to start trusting my own perceptions instead of accepting Carmen's version of events. That first week of journaling had been eye-opening in ways I hadn't expected. I'd started paying attention to my physical responses to Carmen's calls and texts, noticing how my stomach would clench when I saw her name on my phone screen, how my shoulders would tense when I heard her car in my driveway. My body had been trying to warn me about the toxicity of our relationship long before my mind had been willing to acknowledge it. The journal entries had also revealed the extent to which I'd been modifying my behavior to avoid Carmen's disapproval. I'd been censoring my opinions, monitoring my tone of voice, and carefully choosing my words to minimize the risk of triggering one of her defensive reactions. I'd been walking on eggshells in my own family, treating someone who should have been welcoming me as an equal like a volatile authority figure whose moods I needed to manage. But perhaps most importantly, the journaling had helped me see how much of my time and mental energy had been consumed by the relationship with Carmen. I'd been spending hours analyzing our conversations, second-guessing my reactions, and strategizing how to better navigate her moods and expectations. The cognitive load of managing our relationship had been enormous, leaving me exhausted and anxious in ways I'd attributed to normal aging rather than psychological stress. Margaret had also connected me with a support group for women dealing with difficult family relationships. The group met weekly in the basement of St. Mark's Episcopal Church, a circle of 12 folding chairs occupied by women ranging in age from their 30s to their 70s. What we all had in common was the experience of being systematically diminished by people who were supposed to love us. The first meeting I'd attended had been both heartbreaking and validating. Each woman had a different story: daughters-in-law, adult children, spouses, even parents who'd learned to exploit their generosity and kindness. But the emotional patterns were remarkably similar across all our experiences. We'd all been made to feel responsible for other people's happiness while having our own needs dismissed as selfish or unreasonable. Linda, a woman about my age whose adult daughter had been financially exploiting her for years, had said something during my second meeting that stuck with me for days afterward. "The hardest part isn't the money or even the disrespect," she'd shared. "It's realizing that the person you thought you had a loving relationship with was actually just using you. The relationship you cherished never really existed. It was just a transaction disguised as love." That insight had hit me like a physical blow. My relationship with Carmen had never been the slowly developing mother-daughter bond I'd imagined it to be. From her perspective, I'd never been a family member to be loved and respected. I'd been a resource to be managed and exploited. The warmth I'd occasionally seen from her hadn't been genuine affection breaking through her reserve. It had been strategic kindness designed to keep me cooperative and available for her needs. The support group had also helped me understand that my situation wasn't unusual or extreme. Several other women had shared stories of daughter-in-law relationships that followed similar patterns of escalating demands and decreasing respect. The casual cruelty I'd experienced wasn't an aberration. It was a predictable outcome when someone with exploitative tendencies gained access to a generous, family-oriented person who'd been conditioned to prioritize harmony over self-respect. But the most valuable thing I'd learned from therapy and the support group was that I had more power than I'd realized. Carmen's behavior toward me was only possible because I'd been allowing it, and I could choose to stop allowing it at any time. The fear that had kept me accepting poor treatment, the worry that setting boundaries would damage my relationship with Daniel and Sophia, was based on assumptions that might not be true. Dr. Chen had helped me develop what she called a boundary implementation plan. Instead of making dramatic ultimatums or cutting off contact entirely, I would gradually reduce the services I provided while clearly communicating my expectations for respectful treatment. The goal wasn't to punish Carmen, but to create a healthier dynamic where my contributions were appreciated rather than taken for granted. The plan felt both terrifying and liberating. For 3 years, I'd been operating under Carmen's rules, accepting her framework for our relationship, trying to earn her approval by meeting her ever-increasing demands. But I was about to start operating under my own rules, and Carmen was going to have to decide whether she wanted a relationship with me badly enough to treat me with basic human decency. My comment about updating my will had been the first boundary I'd set, and Carmen's reaction would tell me everything I needed to know about her capacity for change and growth. If she was capable of recognizing that she'd hurt me and genuinely wanted to repair our relationship, she'd respond with humility and a commitment to doing better. If she wasn't, she'd probably escalate her attacks, trying to force me back into my old role through guilt, manipulation, or involving Daniel in our conflict. Either way, I was done being Carmen's unpaid servant, emotional punching bag, and convenient scapegoat. The woman who'd written that Facebook comment was someone I barely recognized, strong, clear, unafraid to defend herself. But she was also who I'd been all along, buried under years of conditioning that had taught me to make myself smaller, to accommodate other people's dysfunction. Carmen had made one crucial mistake in posting that meme. She'd pushed me far enough that I'd finally seen our relationship clearly, and there was no going back to the old dynamic once that kind of clarity had been achieved. She'd wanted to joke about my death, but what she'd actually done was kill my willingness to accept her abuse. The real Dorothy Richardson was about to make her reappearance, and Carmen was going to discover that some people are much more formidable when they stop trying to be accommodating. The silence that followed. My Facebook comment stretched for exactly 37 hours. I know the precise timing because I found myself checking my phone obsessively, watching for Carmen's response with the kind of nervous energy I hadn't felt since waiting for college acceptance letters decades ago. But instead of the immediate explosion I'd expected, there was nothing. No defensive comment, no private message, no angry phone call. Just an eerie quiet that felt more ominous than any tantrum would have been. During those 37 hours, I watched Carmen's social media activity with the fascination of an anthropologist studying a foreign culture. She posted her usual content, artfully filtered photos of Sophia playing with organic wooden toys, inspirational quotes about motherhood and gratitude, updates about her latest fitness challenges. But there was something different about the posts, a forced cheerfulness that felt brittle around the edges. The woman who'd casually shared memes about dead grandmothers was now posting saccharine content about blessed family moments and choosing joy every day. What struck me most was how quickly she'd deleted the original meme. By the time I'd checked Facebook the morning after posting my comment, the entire post had vanished as if it had never existed. But my comment remained in my activity log, a digital ghost haunting her timeline even after she'd tried to erase the evidence of her cruelty. Several people had apparently screenshot the exchange before she'd deleted it, because I started receiving private messages from friends and distant relatives who'd seen the interaction and wanted to check on me. My neighbor Helen had been the first to reach out, sending a gentle message that said simply, "Saw what happened on Facebook. Are you okay? Want to talk?" Helen had always been perceptive about family dynamics, probably because she'd raised 4 children and dealt with her share of daughter-in-law drama over the years. Her concern felt genuine in a way that made me realize how isolated I'd become in dealing with Carmen's behavior. But it was the message from my sister Ruth that really drove home the significance of what had happened. Ruth lived 3 states away and rarely engaged with social media beyond posting occasional photos of her grandchildren. For her to have seen the exchange and felt compelled to comment meant that Carmen's post and my response had been particularly striking. "Dorothy," Ruth had written, "I don't know what's been going on with Carmen, but that meme was absolutely unacceptable. I'm proud of you for standing up for yourself. Dad would have been proud too. You've always been too nice for your own good, but there's a difference between being kind and being a doormat. Call me when you get a chance." Reading Ruth's message had brought tears to my eyes, partly from gratitude for her support, but mostly from recognition of a truth I'd been avoiding. I had been too nice for my own good, so focused on maintaining family harmony that I'd forgotten I deserved to be treated with basic respect. Dad would indeed have been proud of me for finally pushing back, but he also would have been heartbroken to know how long I'd accepted treatment that he never would have tolerated for a single day. Our breakthrough moment came on Wednesday evening when Daniel finally called. I'd been expecting this conversation since posting my comment, dreading it and anticipating it in equal measure. Daniel's voice sounded strained when I answered the phone, like someone trying to mediate a conflict he didn't fully understand. "Mom, Carmen told me about the Facebook thing," he began, his tone carefully neutral. "She's pretty upset about your comment, and I'm trying to understand what happened. She said you guys had some kind of misunderstanding, and now there's this whole drama playing out online." The word misunderstanding hit me like a slap. Carmen had already begun rewriting history, transforming her cruel meme into a simple miscommunication, and my justified response into dramatic overreaction. This was exactly the kind of manipulation Dr. Chen had warned me about, the abuser's attempt to control the narrative and minimize their behavior while amplifying the victim's response. "Daniel," I said, choosing my words carefully, "did Carmen show you the meme she posted? The one about grandmothers finally stopping their advice when they're dead?" There was a pause that told me everything I needed to know. "She mentioned it. Was some kind of joke that you took the wrong way," Daniel said, but his voice had lost some of its certainty. "She said she didn't mean anything personal by it. Son, she tagged me in a meme about a dead grandmother. She shared it with her friends and added a comment about people not knowing when to mind their own business. How exactly am I supposed to take that? The silence stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. When Daniel finally spoke, his voice was quieter, more troubled. Mom? I didn't realize. Carmen said it was just a general post about annoying relatives, not specifically about you. But even as he said it, I could hear the doubt creeping in. Daniel was many things, but he wasn't stupid. He could recognize the difference between a general complaint and a targeted attack, especially when his own mother had been tagged in the post. Carmen's version of events was falling apart under the weight of basic logic. Daniel, I need you to understand something, I continued, feeling more confident as I heard his uncertainty. This wasn't an isolated incident. For 3 years, I've been providing constant help to your family while receiving increasingly poor treatment from Carmen. I've bought your groceries, watched Sophia whenever you needed childcare, handled your household emergencies, and absorbed Carmen's criticism and disrespect because I thought it was temporary, that she'd eventually see me as family rather than an inconvenience. I could hear him breathing on the other end of the line, processing information that apparently contradicted whatever narrative Carmen had been feeding him. What kind of poor treatment? He asked. And for the first time in the conversation, he sounded genuinely curious rather than defensive. So I told him. Not everything. That would have taken hours, but enough to paint a clear picture of the pattern that had been developing. The lies about emergency childcare needs to cover up date nights. The financial manipulation where they accepted my assistance while spending frivolously on luxuries. The casual dismissal of my contributions combined with the expectation that those contributions would continue indefinitely. She called me predictable, I said, sharing the overheard phone conversation from their California trip. She said I was desperate to feel needed, and that accepting my help was actually doing me a favor because it gave my empty life purpose. That's not the voice of someone who sees me as family, Daniel. That's someone who sees me as a resource to be managed. The silence that followed was different from the earlier pauses. This wasn't confusion or defensiveness. It was recognition. Daniel was finally hearing information that connected dots he'd probably been trying to ignore for months, or even years. As Carmen's husband, he'd been in the unique position of seeing both sides of our interactions. But he'd apparently been accepting her interpretations of events rather than trusting his own observations. Mom, I had no idea it had gotten this bad, he said finally, his voice heavy with something that might have been guilt. Carmen always made it sound like you were offering to help, like you enjoyed being so involved in our lives. I thought you two were getting along fine. That admission was both validating and heartbreaking. Daniel hadn't been deliberately ignoring my mistreatment. He'd been receiving filtered information that made Carmen look gracious and me look clingy. She'd been managing his perceptions as carefully as she'd been managing mine, ensuring that he saw only what she wanted him to see. Son, when was the last time Carmen and I had a conversation that wasn't about something she needed from me? I asked. When was the last time she asked about my life, my interests, my feelings about anything? When was the last time she thanked me for my help without immediately mentioning something else she needed? I could practically hear Daniel thinking, searching his memory for examples that would contradict my assessment. The fact that he couldn't immediately come up with any spoke volumes about the true nature of my relationship with his wife. I need to talk to Carmen, he said eventually, his voice tight with what sounded like suppressed anger. If what you're telling me is accurate, then we have some serious problems to address. But I felt compelled to warn him about what he was likely to encounter. Daniel, Carmen is very skilled at making her behavior seem reasonable, and my reactions seem excessive. She's going to tell you that I'm being dramatic, that I misunderstood her intentions, that she's actually been very patient with my overwhelming need to be involved in your lives. She might even cry and talk about how hard it is to navigate family, relationships as a new mother. The accuracy of my predictions seemed to surprise him. How do you know that? He asked. Because it's what she's done every time I've tried to address problems between us, I replied. And because I've been learning about these patterns in therapy. Carmen's behavior follows very predictable scripts, Daniel. The problem is that those scripts are designed to avoid accountability rather than solve problems. Mentioning therapy seemed to catch his attention in a way that nothing else had. You're in therapy? Since when? Since I realized that accepting cruel treatment from family members isn't actually a virtue, I said. Since I understood that I've been enabling Carmen's disrespect by refusing to set boundaries or demand basic courtesy. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Daniel asking increasingly pointed questions about specific incidents, and my responses becoming more detailed and confident. By the end of the call, I could tell that his perspective on the situation had shifted dramatically. The son who'd started the conversation trying to smooth over a misunderstanding ended it promising to have serious discussions with his wife about her treatment of his mother. But I also warned him about what might happen next. Carmen is going to escalate before she gets better, I told him, drawing on what I'd learned in therapy and the support group. She's going to test whether you're really going to hold her accountable or if you'll eventually take the path of least resistance and ask me to go back to accepting whatever she dishes out. This is the most important moment in your marriage, Daniel, because it's going to determine whether you're partners or whether she's in charge. After we hung up, I felt emotionally drained, but also oddly hopeful. For the first time in 3 years, Daniel had heard the truth about his wife's treatment of me, and his reaction had been appropriate shock and concern rather than dismissal or minimization. Carmen's system of manipulation depended on controlling information and managing perceptions, but truth had a way of breaking through even the most carefully constructed lies. The real test would come in the next few days, when Carmen realized that her usual tactics weren't working and that Daniel was no longer accepting her version of events without question. Would she be capable of genuine remorse and change? Or would she double down on the cruelty and manipulation that had characterized our relationship from the beginning? My phone buzzed with a text message from Margaret. How are you feeling after setting that first boundary? Proud of you for standing up for yourself. I realized that I did feel proud, maybe for the first time in years. Not proud in an arrogant way, but proud in the deep, quiet way that comes from finally acting in alignment with your own dignity and worth. Carmen could continue her games, could escalate her manipulations, could try every trick in her considerable arsenal. But she could no longer do it to someone who was unaware of what she was doing or unwilling to call it by its proper name. The scared, confused woman who'd been accepting cruel treatment in the name of family harmony was gone. In her place was someone who understood her own value and was prepared to defend it, even if that defense came at a cost. Carmen was about to discover that there were consequences for treating people badly, and those consequences were about to become very real and very expensive. The 37 hours of silence were ending, and the real battle was about to begin. Carmen's counterattack came at 6:47 a.m. on Thursday morning, delivered with the precision of someone who'd spent considerable time crafting the perfect weapon. My phone buzzed with a text message that was so long it appeared in multiple bubbles, each one carefully designed to inflict maximum psychological damage while maintaining plausible deniability about her true intentions. Dorothy, I've been thinking a lot about our Facebook situation, and I'm really hurt by how you've chosen to handle this. I understand you might have misunderstood my post, but your response was so public and so harsh that it's made me question our entire relationship. I've always tried to be respectful of you as Daniel's mother, even when you've overstepped boundaries or made suggestions that undermined my parenting choices. I've bitten my tongue when you've shown up uninvited or taken over family events that I was trying to organize. I've accepted your help even when it came with strings attached, or made me feel like I wasn't capable of taking care of my own family. The text continued across several more bubbles, each paragraph a masterpiece of manipulation disguised as vulnerable honesty. I know you've been going through a difficult time since losing Frank, and I've tried to be patient with your need to feel needed. But threatening to change your will over a silly internet meme feels like emotional blackmail, and it's really concerning to me as someone who cares about your mental health. Daniel and I are worried that you might be struggling more than you've let on, and we want to help you get the support you need. Reading those messages felt like being punched in the stomach while someone explained how concerned they were about your health. Every sentence was crafted to sound caring while delivering a devastating blow. Carmen had taken every act of love and generosity I'd shown over the past 3 years and reframed them as evidence of my emotional instability and inappropriate behavior. She'd positioned herself as the long-suffering victim of my overwhelming neediness, while simultaneously suggesting that my reaction to her cruelty was proof of my declining mental state. But what made the attack so particularly vicious was how she'd woven just enough truth into the lies to make her version of events seem plausible. I had sometimes offered help before being asked. I had occasionally made suggestions about Sophia's care. I had been dealing with grief since Frank's death 2 years ago. Carmen had taken these kernels of reality and twisted them into a narrative that painted me as an unstable woman whose generous nature masked deeper psychological problems. The final text was the most chilling. I think it would be best for everyone if we took some space from each other while you work through whatever you're dealing with. Daniel agrees that some boundaries might be helpful right now. We love you and want what's best for you. But Sophia needs stability, and I need to protect my family from any more drama. I hope you understand. The phrase "Daniel agrees" hit me like a physical blow. Either Carmen was lying about my son's position, or she'd already managed to convince him that I was the problem despite our conversation the previous evening. The thought that she might have successfully manipulated him into abandoning me after everything we'd discussed made me feel nauseated and betrayed in ways I hadn't experienced since Frank's death. But there was something about the messages that felt too polished, too perfectly crafted to be spontaneous emotional responses. The psychological manipulation was so sophisticated that it suggested either extensive research or natural sociopathic tendencies. Carmen had found my vulnerabilities, my grief, my desire to be helpful, my fear of being seen as a burden, and weaponized them with surgical precision. I called Dr. Chen immediately, not caring that it was before office hours. When she called me back 20 minutes later, I read her Carmen's messages while my voice shook with rage and hurt. Dr. Chen listened without interrupting, then asked me to read them again while she took notes. "Dorothy, what you've just read to me is a textbook example of what we call sophisticated psychological abuse," she said when I finished. Carmen has used several advanced manipulation techniques in these messages. She's engaged in gaslighting by rewriting the history of your relationship. She's used projection by accusing you of behaviors that more accurately describe her own actions. She's employed false concern as a weapon, suggesting that your completely normal reaction to her cruelty is evidence of mental illness. Dr. Chen explained that the most dangerous aspect of Carmen's messages was how they were designed to make me doubt my own perceptions and reactions. She's trying to convince you that your entirely justified anger about her meme is actually proof that you're unstable. She's taking your acts of love and generosity and reframing them as evidence of your neediness and poor boundaries. This is a classic abuser tactic, making the victim responsible for the abuse they've suffered. But what had particularly caught Dr. Chen's attention was Carmen's claim about Daniel agreeing with her assessment. "That's a manipulation technique called triangulation," she explained. "She's attempting to isolate you by suggesting that even your own son sees you as the problem. It's designed to make you feel like you're alone and that everyone agrees with her version of events." The conversation with Dr. Chen helped me understand that Carmen's messages weren't emotional reactions. They were strategic attacks designed to force me back into compliance. She'd realized that her usual subtle manipulations were no longer working, so she'd escalated to more overt psychological warfare. The goal wasn't to repair our relationship, but to reestablish her dominance and my submission. Armed with this understanding, I decided to test Carmen's claim about Daniel's agreement. I called my son at work, something I rarely did, but the situation felt urgent enough to warrant the interruption. When Daniel answered, he sounded tired and stressed in a way that made me think he'd been dealing with considerable pressure at home. "Mom, I was actually going to call you later," he said before I could explain why I was contacting him. "Carmen and I had a long talk last night after I spoke with you, and things got pretty intense. She's not handling this well." That admission told me everything I needed to know about Carmen's claim that Daniel agreed with her position. "Son, did you tell Carmen that you thought I needed boundaries and space?" "God, no," Daniel replied, his voice sharp with what sounded like frustration. "I told her that her behavior toward you has been unacceptable, and that she needs to apologize and make serious changes if she wants our marriage to work. She did not take that well." Daniel went on to describe a conversation that had lasted until nearly 3 a.m, during which Carmen had deployed every manipulation technique in her arsenal. She'd cried, accused him of choosing his mother over his wife, threatened to take Sophia and leave, and finally suggested that I was experiencing some kind of mental health crisis that was affecting my judgment. She kept insisting that you've always been invasive and overwhelming, that she's been patient with your grief-related neediness, and that your reaction to her meme was completely disproportionate, Daniel explained. But when I asked her for specific examples of you being invasive, she couldn't give me any. When I pointed out that you've never offered help without being asked first, she changed the subject. When I asked her to explain exactly what was wrong with your Facebook comment, she started crying and saying I was attacking her. The relief I felt hearing Daniel's account was overwhelming. Carmen's most important manipulation, convincing my son that I was the problem, had failed completely. Not only had she not managed to turn him against me, but her attempts to do so had actually opened his eyes to the full extent of her manipulative behavior. "Daniel, she sent me some text messages this morning, claiming that you agreed with her position," I told him. "She said you both thought I needed space and boundaries." The silence that followed was filled with a tension I could feel through the phone. When Daniel finally spoke, his voice was cold in a way I'd rarely heard from my gentle son. "She's lying, Mom. We never discussed anything like that, and I certainly never agreed to cut you off or suggested you were mentally unstable. If she's telling you I said those things, then she's deliberately trying to isolate you and make you think you don't have support." That conversation marked a turning point in Daniel's understanding of his wife's character. Up until that moment, he'd been able to explain away her behavior as misunderstandings or stress-related reactions. But discovering that she'd lied about his position in messages to his mother had crossed a line that even he couldn't rationalize. "I need to show you something when I get home," Daniel said. "Carmen doesn't know I saw this, but she's been saying some pretty terrible things about you to her friends and family. I found some text message conversations on her phone last night that, well, they're going to be hard for you to read, but I think you need to know what she's really been saying about you." The idea that there were even worse things Carmen had been saying privately was both horrifying and somehow validating. If Daniel had seen evidence that corroborated everything I'd been telling him about her treatment of me, then at least I wouldn't have to worry about being believed or supported. But Carmen wasn't finished with her campaign to reestablish control. Throughout Thursday afternoon, I received a series of messages from her friends and family members, each one carefully crafted to seem like genuine concern while actually delivering Carmen's talking points about my supposed mental health crisis and inappropriate behavior. Her sister Brenda sent a message that said, "Hi, Dorothy. Carmen told me you've been going through a really hard time lately. I just wanted you to know that we're all thinking of you and hoping you can get the help you need. Family relationships can be so complicated, especially when grief is involved. Maybe some time apart would be good for everyone while you work through things." Carmen's mother called and left a voicemail that was a masterpiece of passive-aggressive concern. "Dorothy, dear, Carmen is so worried about you. She's been telling me how you've been struggling since Frank passed, and she's concerned that you might be putting too much pressure on yourself to be involved in Daniel and Sophia's lives. Sometimes when we're grieving, we don't realize how our behavior affects others. I hope you'll consider getting some professional support to help you through this difficult time. Each message followed the same template, expressing concern for my mental health while reinforcing Carmen's narrative that my reaction to her cruelty was evidence of my instability rather than a normal response to being treated badly. The coordination was so obvious that it suggested Carmen had spent considerable time briefing her support network on exactly what to say and how to say it. But the most insidious aspect of this campaign was how it made me second-guess my own perceptions, even while I intellectually understood what was happening. The sheer number of people expressing concern about my mental state created a kind of psychological pressure that was hard to resist. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe grief had affected my judgment more than I realized. Maybe I was seeing malice where there was only misunderstanding. It was Margaret who helped me recognize this doubt for what it was, the intended effect of Carmen's manipulation campaign. Dorothy, you've been in therapy, you've been part of a support group, you've had professional validation that Carmen's behavior is abusive, she reminded me during an emergency coffee meeting. Don't let her convince you that getting help and setting boundaries is evidence of mental illness. The fact that she's mobilizing her entire social network to gaslight you actually proves how calculated and manipulative she really is. Margaret was right, but the emotional toll of being under such a coordinated attack was exhausting. Carmen wasn't just trying to win our individual conflict, she was trying to destroy my reputation, isolate me from family support, and convince everyone that I was an unstable woman whose perceptions couldn't be trusted. But she'd made one crucial miscalculation in her strategy. By lying about Daniel's position and by escalating to such obviously manipulative tactics, she'd finally revealed her true nature to the one person whose opinion mattered most. My son now saw his wife clearly for the first time, and what he saw was someone capable of extraordinary cruelty and deception toward the people who should matter most to her. The war Carmen had started with her meme was no longer just between her and me. She'd drawn Daniel into the conflict by lying about his position, and that lie was going to cost her far more than she'd ever imagined. The turning point came exactly 1 week after Carmen's coordinated attack campaign, when Daniel arrived at my house carrying a manila folder and wearing the grim expression of someone who'd discovered something that changed everything. He'd called ahead, asking if we could talk privately, and the tone of his voice had suggested this wasn't going to be an ordinary family visit. "Mom, I need to show you something," he said, settling into the chair across from me at my kitchen table. After Carmen lied about what I'd said to you, I started paying more attention to her communications. What I found is worse than anything we've discussed. Daniel opened the folder and pulled out printed screenshots of text message conversations between Carmen and her sister Brenda, dating back over 2 years. The messages were arranged chronologically, creating a documented timeline of Carmen's real feelings about me and her deliberate strategy to exploit my generosity while isolating me from family support. The earliest messages were merely dismissive. "Daniel's mom bought groceries again without being asked," Carmen had texted Brenda 18 months ago. "I swear she's trying to prove she's indispensable. It's kind of pathetic but also convenient." But as the timeline progressed, the messages became increasingly cruel and calculating. "I figured out how to manage Dorothy," read one message from 8 months ago. "I just hint about our financial stress when she's dropping off groceries she paid for, and she immediately offers to help with other expenses. She's so desperate to feel needed that she'll basically pay us to let her be involved in our lives. Daniel has no idea how much money she's actually giving us." But it was the messages from 3 months ago that truly revealed the depth of Carmen's manipulation and contempt. "Dorothy is getting too comfortable offering advice about Sophia," she'd written to Brenda. "I need to shut that down before she thinks she has any real say in how we raise our daughter. I'm going to start making her feel guilty about interfering, so she'll back off but keep providing childcare and money. The conversation that followed detailed Carmen's strategy for maintaining my financial and practical support while destroying my confidence and sense of belonging in the family. She described her plan to gradually increase criticism of my interference, while simultaneously escalating requests for assistance, creating a psychological dynamic where I would work harder to prove my worth while feeling increasingly insecure about my place in their lives. The beauty of it is that she'll blame herself, Carmen had texted. She'll think she's being too pushy, so she'll try to prove she's not by doing even more for us while asking for less recognition. It's like training a dog. Reward the behavior you want and ignore the behavior you don't. Reading those words felt like being punched in the stomach by someone I'd loved and trusted. Carmen hadn't just been ungrateful or thoughtless. She'd been systematically manipulating my emotions and exploiting my love for my family with the calculated precision of a psychological predator. The woman I'd tried so hard to welcome into our family had seen me as nothing more than a resource to be exploited and a problem to be managed. But the most devastating messages were the ones from just 2 weeks ago, right before she'd posted the meme. Carmen had been describing her frustration with my continued presence in their lives, complaining to Brenda that I was becoming too comfortable and needed to be reminded of my place. "I'm going to post something that will really get under her skin," she'd written. Something about annoying old relatives who don't know when to shut up. If she takes the bait and reacts, I can use her response to prove to Daniel that she's unstable and needs boundaries. If she doesn't react, she'll know I see her as a joke, and maybe she'll finally back off. The meme hadn't been a moment of poor judgment or a stress-related lapse in empathy. It had been a deliberate psychological attack, designed to either humiliate me into submission or provoke a reaction that Carmen could use to justify further mistreatment. She'd planned the entire scenario, anticipating my possible responses and preparing to use any reaction as evidence of my supposed instability. Daniel's voice was quiet and strained as he explained how he'd discovered the messages. "I found her. Phone unlocked on the kitchen counter Tuesday night, and I saw a text notification from Brenda that mentioned your name. I know I shouldn't have looked, but after everything that's been happening, I felt like I needed to understand what was really going on." What he'd found had shattered his understanding of his wife's character and his marriage. The messages revealed not just Carmen's manipulation of me, but her contempt for Daniel himself. She'd described him as clueless and easy to manage, someone who could be controlled through strategic emotional displays and careful information management. "She's been playing us against each other, Mom," Daniel said, his voice breaking slightly. "She's been lying to both of us about what the other one said or did, creating conflict between us so we wouldn't compare notes and figure out what she was really doing." The revelation explained so many confusing interactions over the past 3 years. Times when Daniel had seemed distant or defensive, when Carmen had claimed he'd said things that didn't sound like him, when family dynamics had felt strained for reasons I couldn't identify. She'd been orchestrating it all, manipulating both of us to maintain her position of power and control. But perhaps the most shocking discovery was the financial calculation Carmen had been keeping. Daniel had found a spreadsheet on her laptop documenting every dollar I'd spent on their family over the past 2 years. Groceries, gifts for Sophia, restaurant meals I'd treated them to, even the gas money for driving them to appointments. The total was staggering. Over $18,000 in direct financial support, not counting the value of my childcare services or household assistance. "She's been tracking it like a business expense," Daniel explained, showing me the spreadsheet. "There are notes about which approaches work best for getting you to offer money, which emotional buttons to push when she needs emergency childcare, even calculations about how much money they save annually by having you provide unpaid services." The spreadsheet was perhaps the most damning evidence of all, because it proved that Carmen's exploitation of me hadn't been thoughtless or accidental. She'd been running a careful cost-benefit analysis of our relationship, maximizing the financial and practical benefits she received while minimizing any emotional or social cost to herself. "Daniel, what are you going to do?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer from the resignation in his voice. "I've already started divorce proceedings," he said quietly. "I can't be married to someone capable of this level of manipulation and cruelty, especially toward you. And I can't let Sophia grow up thinking this kind of behavior is normal or acceptable." The conversation that followed was one of the most difficult of my life, as Daniel grappled with the realization that his marriage had been built on deception and manipulation. Carmen hadn't just been a difficult daughter-in-law. She'd been an abusive spouse who'd isolated him from his mother while systematically exploiting both of us for financial and practical gain. The custody battle that ensued was brutal, but brief. Carmen's text messages, the financial spreadsheet, and testimony from several witnesses about her manipulative behavior created a compelling case for Daniel's fitness as a primary parent. Her attempt to paint me as mentally unstable backfired spectacularly when Dr. Chen provided expert testimony about the psychological abuse I'd endured and my healthy progress in therapy. 6 months later, Daniel and Sophia moved into the apartment above my garage while their house sold and custody arrangements were finalized. Carmen's parental rights weren't terminated, but her visitation was supervised after she'd made several concerning statements about getting back at Daniel and me for ruining her life. The most satisfying moment came when Carmen tried one final manipulation, calling me directly to apologize and ask for another chance at a relationship. But her apology was filled with the same manipulative language I'd learned to recognize, minimizing her behavior, blaming external stress, and hinting that my forgiveness would prove my character as a Christian woman. "Carmen," I said calmly, "I've learned that apologies without changed behavior are just manipulation tactics. You've shown me exactly who you are over the past 3 years, and I believe you. We'll be cordial for Sophia's sake, but we'll never have a relationship beyond that." The silence that followed told me everything I needed to know. Carmen had expected her charm and psychological manipulation to work one more time, to reset our relationship so she could begin the cycle of exploitation all over again. When she realized that wasn't going to happen, her true nature emerged. One final time. "You're a bitter old woman who destroyed a family because you couldn't handle not being the center of attention," she snarled before hanging up. Today, 2 years later, I'm sitting in my kitchen writing this story while Sophia plays with her toys in the living room and Daniel prepares dinner in the apartment upstairs. My relationship with my son has never been stronger, built now on honest communication and mutual respect rather than managed information and manipulated emotions. I've become something of an advocate for other women dealing with emotional abuse, from family members, sharing my story in support groups and online forums. The response has been overwhelming. Hundreds of women recognizing their own experiences in mine, finding validation and strength to set their own boundaries and demand better treatment. The will that I'd threatened to update? I actually did revise it, but not in the way Carmen probably expected. Instead of cutting people out, I added provisions for a scholarship fund supporting women escaping abusive relationships and therapy services for families dealing with emotional manipulation. Carmen still sees Sophia every other weekend, but their relationship remains strained and superficial. Sophia, now 4 years old, has begun asking why Mommy Carmen talks mean sometimes, and why she has to have a special lady present during their visits. Daniel and I answer her questions honestly but age-appropriately, focusing on the importance of treating people with kindness and respect. As for me, I've learned that setting boundaries isn't selfish. It's essential. I've learned that being generous doesn't mean being exploitable, and that love without respect isn't really love at all. Most importantly, I've learned that it's never too late to reclaim your dignity and demand the treatment you deserve. That Facebook comment about updating my will wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning of the rest of my life, lived on my own terms with people who see me as a whole person rather than a resource to be managed. And that's made all the difference. If you're dealing with someone who treats your generosity as weakness, remember that you have more power than you realize. Your time, energy, and resources are gifts to be given freely, not obligations to be extracted through manipulation. Don't forget to like this video if it resonated with you, and subscribe to our channel for more stories about finding strength, setting boundaries, and reclaiming your worth. Your story matters, your feelings are valid, and you deserve to be treated with respect by everyone in your life, especially family.